I'm a retired professor from the University of Toronto, and I co-authored with the Mexican Compañero a book on Continental Crucible, Big Business Workers and Unions in the Transformation of North America. That's my claim to fame. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about go a little bit further, or not addition, to what, especially to what Mary Luce did about the context. She made the point. I'm going to just make 10 points, maybe 11. The violence and disappearances cannot be understood in terms of drug violence or the war against drugs, because the state and the drug cartels are very intermeshed in complex ways that are more fragmented. Some local governments are with different cartels, some state governments with different, but I like to refer to it as the war within the drug state, the drug cartel state complex. But really, as Hepzibah pointed out and Mary Luce pointed out, the repression predates that. The repression is a repression aimed at breaking, preventing resistance to these radical neoliberal reforms that are destroying social rights and giving away the national patrimony, the national resources of Mexico, as in the case of oil. Some of it not yet given away, but in process. Second point I want to make, and I think is an important point that's often neglected, is that these neoliberal reforms, this war on society and on the working class that's been going on for the last 40 years, did not come out of the heads of politicians, not even out of the heads of economists. It came out of the heads of the corporate elite, of the capitalist class of each of the three countries. They have systematically organized since the early 1970s. In our book, in our book that I did with Edo Velasco, we show how in each of the three countries of North America, the capitalist classes in the late 60s, early 70s were upset about political turmoil, workers' militancy, and so on, and organized themselves for class war. So in the early 70s, they organized in the US the Business Roundtable, the most powerful organization in the US, limited to the top executives, the CEOs themselves, not representatives, of the top corporations of the US. In Canada, they formed the Business Council on National Issues in '76 for the same purpose, modeled on the Business Roundtable, limited to the top officers. It's now called the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. The newspapers rarely mention them, but they are the most powerful organizations in each of the countries. And in Mexico, the most important one is a smaller one called the Consejo Mexicano de Hombres de Negocios, Mexican Businessmen's Council, which recently changed its name to the Mexican Council of Business because there's now one woman member of the 40 members that it was limited to. Tremendously powerful organizations. There are other organizations too. There was the development of a class consensus among the capitalist class that the workers had to be put in their place, wages had to be cut, discipline had to be restored, social rights had to be smashed. It's not secretive. It's just the press owned by the same people don't talk about it. There are books about it. In our book, we draw on other books that have talked about it. But they had meetings. They organized much better than we've been organizing lately. Groups to get together to convince capitalists that were too narrowly focused, that they had a broader class view. They had an agenda. And now the center of now that they've smashed unions in the private sector in the US and Canada, Mexico is a different system because the unions were so state-linked. Now that they smashed the private sector unions, they're going over after the public sector unions, and the number one area of struggle right now in the three countries is education. The big foundations, the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, Microsoft, the Walton Foundation, which is Walmart, are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into privatizing education and demonizing the unions as the culprit. And in Mexico, Paul has written something. What's the name of the group?
Mexicanos Primero.
Mexicans First, which is the business lobby to privatize education. So what I want to emphasize is that a class war has been coming on for 30 years, but in Mexico the resistance is more strong and the repression is more fierce. The third point I want to make is that the U.S. is deeply involved, as was alluded to by the other speakers. It's deeply involved in training intelligence officers, in training the military, in giving weapons, and it understands, and NAFTA, in a way, the Zapatista uprising on the day NAFTA started was a wake-up call to the U.S. Mexico was too inefficient in controlling its population. We have to help Mexico get its act together. I'm not saying that the U.S. promoted the drug war, but it promoted the militarization of policing in Mexico. And just as the free market or neoliberal transformation of Chile came through a coup sponsored by the U.S. and bloody repression by a dictatorship, so the neoliberal transformation in Mexico is accompanied by bloody repression. The fourth point I want to make is that Mexico is too important to the U.S. to allow it to have really radical democratic reform. Mexican workers are an important part of the U.S. labor market. The factories, the maquilas along the northern border are an essential integrated part of continental production. And Mexico is contiguous with the U.S. If the U.S. is so upset about Cuba, and now has declared Venezuela a threat to American national security, which Obama just declared, imagine if Mexico had a really democratic government that tried to reverse the neoliberal reforms. So the U.S. is deeply involved, and if resistance grows more strong, the U.S. will get more deeply involved. And I'll come back to that in a moment, what some of the implications. One point about the Mexican insurgency. There has been an insurgency going on in rural areas of Mexico for a number of years against neoliberal reform. It's not new, it's just not reported in North America, except in very dramatic moments. It's been going on in Chiapas, in Oaxaca, in Guerrero, in Michoacan, and the teachers are often at the forefront of that, but it's peasant groups too. But what we need to remember is that these are rural areas under attack by neoliberalism with strong communitarian traditions, and sometimes there's a strong resonance, response, support in the cities among students. But these rural areas by themselves, in my view, cannot bring down the regime, because Mexico today is not a rural country. It is a country of intense rural resistance, but 75% of the country is now urban. And most of the urban population are people who sell their labor power, are working class in the broadest sense, sell their labor power in the formal or informal market. And so, and much of that working class is now located, because of the relocation of industry that took place in the last 30 years, much of it is located in exactly the regions that Hepzibah was talking about it. The border regions of the strongest cartel domination are also the regions of tremendous industrial production, which interestingly goes on, if I'm right, quite uninterrupted by all the violence. People are being killed, people are being disappeared every day. Industrial production goes on, moving the goods across the border, and it's very important to the U.S. and to U.S. companies, because a lot of it is just-in-time production. And the other point I want to make that I think most of you know is a significant proportion of the Mexican working class lives in the United States, works in the United States, many of them without legal documents. That has implications for resistance, because these Mexican workers in the U.S. still have very strong ties. They're Mexican nationals, many of them. They have families in Mexico. Some of them have dreams of going back to Mexico. And so what happens in Mexico affects these people, and what happens to these people affects Mexico. The eighth point I want to make is that the Mexico crisis is not going to go away. It is getting deeper. The repression is getting more severe, and it's likely to get more severe as Peña Nieto tries to implement his reforms. Because as Mariluz mentioned very well on Wednesday night, while there have been all of these terrible neoliberal reforms, a lot of them they've not been able to implement a lot of them because of popular resistance. And there's tremendous resistance to the oil privatization, which is on paper going forward, but hasn't happened yet, and to many other things like that, and especially to the education reforms that they've enacted, but they haven't been able to implement generally. The Mexican government has to defeat these popular movements to carry out the reforms that is enacted on paper. So, and on top of that, Mexico is in the middle of a at some point, in a deepening economic crisis. A crisis that has been long-term, but is now becoming sharper because of the tremendous drop in oil prices. 1/3 of public revenues at all levels in Mexico come from oil revenues. And those revenues have dropped, I forget what the figures are, dramatically in the last year. That means there's an increasing fiscal crisis, which means even more cutbacks. The other thing that really confounds and makes the situation much more complex is well, on the one hand, the state has become more repressive, as has been mentioned. The drug war and the drug cartels have become increasingly fragmented. Whereas, as Hernandez Navarro pointed out the other night, he said Mexico was a narco state, where the state made deals with the drug cartels, but the state had tremendous power. The national state had tremendous power over state governments, over municipal governments, and it could deal from a position of strength with the few cartels. But partly because of the war on drugs, partly for other reasons, the cartels in many areas have been fragmented. And there's a war going on between many different gangs. And the central government doesn't have control over all the states and all of the municipal government. It's a very complex, fluid situation of violence, which really is a quagmire, swamp, nightmare for popular movements. Not only is there repression, but the repression has various forms and not centrally controlled. And I want to make two more points quickly. Our challenge is to build a movement that defends human rights, as broad a movement as possible. But it's also, in the longer term, to build a class movement. And here I go back to the point that Mexico is a working class country. Though the greatest militancy right now is among rural people, many of whom are working class, some of whom are migrant workers and come back and forth. And in that respect, we have to try to foster more solidarity among workers of the three countries. Last point. 2006 was a moment where there were elements of what needs to happen on a broader scale. there were transnational protests among Mexican workers. So there were very important protests in Mexico City over the fraudulent election. It wasn't led by the working class, but most of the participants, or at least a large portion, were workers. And there were massive protests for a few months in Mexico City. In the state, okay, very quickly, in the state of,
I didn't say anything.
in the state of Oaxaca, the teachers' movement had a strike. There was brutal repression. The whole city rose up against the government and took over the city for several months. The national government didn't move for its own Machiavellian reasons, but it showed a model of how the teachers' rebellion, with demands linked to the needs of the people, could spark a larger rebellion. It couldn't win in one state alone. It could win nationally. But the third rebellion in 2006 was the Immigrant Rights Rebellion in the United States. I was in Mexico City on May Day 2006, and it was the day of the immigrant rights protests in the U.S. And there was a tremendous buzz and enthusiasm among the crowd about what was happening in the U.S. There was great awareness back and forth. And so I think we need these kinds of transnational things. And going back to the point that the U.S. is not hands off Mexico, it's not going to be hands off Mexico. The struggle to transform Mexico may begin in Mexico, but it has to also take place in the rest of North America. And now
Oh, sorry.
no, I'm done.